I have to go to the expert in agriculture. Ms. Shi, you were a researcher about China's agricultural reform. And over the past years, you have picked up your own experimental program, which is your own farm. You want to do something different. Help us to understand, number one document, the so-called structural reform supply side, likely to help you to solve problems and any farmers in China.
I noticed that this year, the number one document, there are 3 points. The first one is it recognizes our situation of agricultural production is overproduction. And second one is it focuses on how we can change our production way into a more sustainable way.
Explain, please, especially for our international viewers.
For example, like green food or organic food, use less pesticide and fertilizer, a more efficient way to produce food in the future.
Mr. Huang, you have been in China working on many of the poverty alleviation related to agriculture in this country. What do you think? This number one document provide much inspiration?
Well, what's interesting is that the number one document for almost a decade and a half has focused on agriculture. So what is different? What is meant by supply side policies? A decade ago, it was about increasing the quantity, but that's not the problem. China is self-sufficient in many crops. So it's about quality, improving the value added, food safety issues. I think a very important aspect of the new document relates to land tenure policies, because the big question is people are moving from rural areas to urban areas, and then people moving from urban areas to rural areas. And the question of whether or not you can reallocate the land is a key factor, I think, in this document.
It is a wonderful document. I mean, it's number one document to say the least, and they talk about structural reform to say the least, and also it's supposed to provide a lot of new grounds for farmers. But, Ms. Shi, remember at the very beginning of China's agricultural reform, it was bottom up. Now it is more and more about top down. The question is whether we can have both of these patterns work at the same time to motivate people.
I think this time the policy, although we saw it's from top to down, but actually there are, I think, for example, like our experiment, My Farm, we have been running the farm, like the new model called community-supported agriculture for almost 10 years. I think also this time the number one document focus on how we change from the quality to quantity to quality. It also have some experiment or experience from the bottom. So I think our experiment also gives a lot of suggestions to our policy.
Give me some examples.
For example, My Farm, we produce all of our food.
We don't want to do advertisement for your farm, but it is a very interesting social experiment project going on here in China.
Yeah, because we already have about 1,000 those kind of farms in all over China.
Right.
So those kind of farms, we produce food and directly sell to the local markets, to the consumers. So it's an innovation for the farm, for the market, and also an innovation on the production side. We don't use any pesticide and fertilizer, and we also have more focus on more technologies to reduce the inputs from outside of the farm.
But the question is, how much about that quality change likely to impact on the ordinary lives of the Chinese? I understand your vegetables or your produce actually tends to be much more expensive than those being sold, let's just say, collected from whatever farm all over China. So is it likely to change the lives of real Chinese farmers, or this is only sporadic experiments to fit to the lifestyles of China's upper middle class?
I think it's a good experiment. It's a very positive step. Just by talking to Madam Shi, clearly in her farm, I mean, you have a bigger scale. You have bigger scale, and also what they do is more catering the changing taste and preference of urban Chinese.
Very interesting to talk about the the changing taste. It is not only the changing of the taste itself, but also the changing of the structures of the Chinese economy. For example, how much agriculture is playing its role today. The proportion of China's agriculture sector in the national GDP continues to decline, which indicates a need for new agricultural development, some say. It's believed that the proportion about 10% is the turning point in the national economy. In 2014, China reached a proportion of 9.2%, while 2015 it's already 9%. However, it's much higher, of course, than most of the developed economies, such as those that are having the agriculture as 1.12% in the US and 4.4% rather in Russia. So, Mr. Huang, from the development stage that you have been researching on for years, which stage is China right now? And is this policy really the appropriate one for the current stage?
Well, China is now an upper middle income country. And as you noted, high income countries, agriculture has a significantly smaller share of GDP. What I think is really noticeable in China is that approximately 30% of the labor force is still in agriculture. That's a very large percentage. And many of them are operating in relatively small farms. And so when you look forward, what's going to happen in China? Well, you want higher incomes per farmer in agriculture, and that means that 10 years, 15 years from now, there'll probably be fewer people in agriculture, but each household farmer or each farm will have a higher income level. That's why quality, price improvements, supply chain are becoming increasingly important. And this is where I think land tenure policies are important, because you have lots of small plots. The farms are not economically large enough. So you're going to have consolidation in the farm sector. Larger farms in terms of acreage, but fewer farmers in terms of the share of the working labor force in China.
That, of course, trend that Mr. Huang talked about, Mr. Xu, is coupled with a lot of other changes, urbanization, for example, and also the importance of industrialization on a higher notch in a way, better quality, higher quality. How does all of these factors play together?
I think they move in the same direction. I very much share the viewpoint articulated by Mr. Huang. And clearly, we need to scale, and we're just not competitive. And perhaps at this point, we have too many goals. So, for example, food safety. Maybe at some point, we need to relax the constraint on that goal. And also in agriculture, we have so-called red line. I don't know, maybe at some point, that constraint has to be relaxed. And earlier in your program, you said a lot of urban Chinese, they want to live in countryside. For example, I don't mind living in her farm. I mean, you have less pollution.
Well, Ms.
And
Xu
there's
has
no
to
traffic.
nod or wave her head for that.
Therefore, there is a need and to turn so-called a dead capital into real capital.
Right. You've already got a volunteer labor.
And maybe a member.
A member, yes, that's true. That's a new farm that we were talking about here. But you see, also in the United States, even though it's such a small percentage agriculture in terms of national GDP, but it is also the so-called traditional farms, large-scale production, coupled with so-called new farms, which is relatively with new lifestyles, encouraging quality produce. Is China far away from there, or are we already in a very different stage?
I think if we compare Chinese agriculture with American agriculture, it's very different because American agriculture is big farm, based on very big, huge farms. But in China, we are very small scale, and also mostly farmers are indigenous people. So I think for this time, the #1 document, there is one word, focus on appropriate scale. It's very different from formal #1 documents. I think that's...
I can see Ms. Shi studied word by word on some of the most important paragraphs. Having said that, though, the agriculture reform, as the #1 document, usually provides some inspiration as to how China's economic development is likely to proceed for the year to come. So in this one, it talks about reforms, supply-side structural reforms, and also innovation. The question is, the rest of the economy, Mr. Xu, of China, is it likely to follow suit? To what extent?
I think it's really the same because when we look at quantity versus quality, every year we look at GDP growth rate. I think this year, clearly we have reduced emphasis on GDP growth rate. That's very much the same thing. We need to emphasize on quality, not quantity. Also, at the same time, in the rest of the economy, consolidation is also needed. For example, manufacturing sector. When you have consolidation, you need to accept slower GDP growth rate.
Okay. Mr. Huang, there are a lot of uncertain factors in the Chinese economy, including internal issues, and also include, relations with the United States with a very unpredictable future at this point. So, do you think China is likely to make a big stride in terms of its urgency of reform its economy for structural reform, as he said?
Well, it's clear that China is becoming more consumption-oriented. The services sector is growing more rapidly than manufacturing. It's getting less dependent upon external trade. And this, I think, will serve China well, particularly if protectionism rises globally. I think China is going to look at different markets, probably look within ASEAN and East Asia a bit more, looking more towards Central Asia, the connectivity to Europe. So I think all these are going to shape the nature of the Chinese market. I think critically in all this is the question of what kind of jobs China is likely to try to encourage in the coming years. It's not going to be in agriculture. The employment in agriculture is going to decline. It's going to be in services. But the question is, can you generate high value service jobs, ones which will generate the salaries that Chinese aspire to? And I think that's the key, the policies that will encourage more higher value services, not just services in general.
Not the low quality services like serving in a restaurant, but rather higher quality.
Yeah.
But that takes a lot of effort. And also
yes.
training of the general public as well.
That's why actually just opening up service actually is critically important, not just restaurant, and we're talking about entertainment. Actually service can be extended into financial service, for example, insurance, so on and so forth.
Of course, those are some of the very hard battles to be fought, whether bilateral or multilateral.
Yes,
we
indeed.
understand the bilateral investment treaty, for example, China and the United States also has a lot to do with negotiation in this area. Having said that, though, where do you think the agriculture is likely to be for China? I mean, after all, you still have a huge percentage of China's population being farmers. Whether they are now living in the rural land is another question. On the other hand, their fate is still hanging in the air with the social reform, economic reform going on in this country. Ms. Shi, I know you're a spokeswoman almost for the farmers here in China. You're very much on their rights. So tell us more about your thoughts.
I still think our challenge is the small farmers, autonomized, very individualized farmers, when they're facing with the big market. So how they can connect with the big market? So many middle class people, they want healthy food, safe food, but the small peasants, they don't know about like packaging, how to standardize their production. So that's kind of barrier between farmers and the market. So in the future, what kind of service by the government or by the market can give to the farmers, especially like how they can organize the farmers, the peasants, to provide better quality food to the consumers.
And who will organize them? And also how is it likely to be shared, the benefits? I think those are all very big questions over there. Farmers' rights, of course, is extremely important here in China. We see the farmers playing contribution role to the growth of the Chinese economy over decades. So what is the right place for them, Mr. Xu?
Right place for them. In my opinion, farmers, they should have the choice, not just being in rural China. And I think in the earlier of the program, you talk about the migration between cities to countryside, and also from countryside to the city. And in one area, for example, social security reform.
Right.
A few years ago, a lot of farmers, they decided to cash in the social security